The political arena has seen its share of chaotic weeks, but this one didn't just shake Washington, it cracked the floor beneath it. The eruption began the moment new evidence surfaced involving former FBI Director James Comey, sending shockwaves through the media, legal circles, and every corner of the political spectrum. But what made this moment truly seismic wasn't just Comey being thrust back into the spotlight, it was what happened next. A sudden, frantic scramble inside Gavin Newsom's orbit as a broader power shift within the Democratic Party ignited almost overnight. This isn't a story of one scandal. It's a collision of two political storms moving at full speed toward the same point. One exposing old questions about federal power, oversight, and accountability. The other revealing cracks inside a party already struggling to maintain unity in an era of ideological fragmentation. Put the two together, and you get the most volatile political moment of the year. Comey's reemergence into the national conversation happened the instant the new evidence dropped. Legal analysts immediately went to work interpreting what it might mean. Political commentators dissected every angle, and members of Congress, some of whom hadn't spoken Comey's name publicly in years, found themselves being asked where they stood. For some, this was confirmation of long-held concerns. For others, it was an opportunity to reopen debates they felt never received proper closure. The reaction wasn't measured. It wasn't slow. It was immediate and intense. House Republicans moved first. They framed the evidence as vindication, arguing it reopened questions they'd been pushing for years. Committees began signaling interest in further inquiry. Prominent Republicans took to cable news and social platforms, calling the new information a turning point that demanded answers. Not eventually, but now. Their messaging was sharp, disciplined, and unmistakable. They saw momentum and seized it. Comey's critics mobilized like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. Meanwhile, his defenders found themselves struggling to balance caution with clarity. The uncertainty around what the evidence really meant led many Democrats to tread carefully, avoiding direct commentary until more details emerged. But while Washington scrambled to make sense of Comey's situation, a second crisis was unfolding, one that hit the Democratic Party at the worst possible moment, because just as questions surrounding Comey resurfaced, internal tensions in the party erupted in spectacular fashion. And at the center of that storm was Governor Gavin Newsom, who suddenly found himself navigating a power shift no one predicted, but everyone instantly felt. The shift didn't come from a single vote, a single speech, or a single event. It came from the growing divide between two factions. Establishment leaders defending traditional party structures and rising figures pushing aggressively for ideological realignment. The Comey news didn't cause the divide, but it accelerated it, blasting it into full view at a moment when the party could least afford the exposure. Strategists inside Newsom's circle saw it instantly. They recognized the risk. They understood that if the media linked Comey's controversy with internal Democratic tension, even loosely, it could create a narrative spiral that would become impossible to control. And in the political world, perception can spread faster than fact-checking ever could. That's why Newsom's team scrambled. They weren't just responding to Comey, they were responding to the reality that stories don't stay isolated anymore. They merge, they compound, they reinforce each other, and they can create narratives bigger and more damaging than the sum of their parts. Establishment Democrats began issuing carefully worded statements calling for calm, due process, and focus. They hoped to project stability, but their messaging didn't land evenly across the base. Progressive activists, already frustrated with long-standing party hierarchies, interpreted the moment differently. They saw the Comey situation as an example of institutional inconsistency, and in their eyes, it highlighted the exact problems they've been trying to bring to the forefront. As commentary spread, the divide widened. Younger, activist-oriented voices demanded transparency. They argued that the party couldn't afford selective scrutiny. Either institutions should be held accountable across the board, or the party risked losing trust entirely. Their tone was sharp, urgent, and unapologetic. Older, more establishment-aligned leaders pushed for patience and caution. They argued that rushing to conclusions would only deepen divisions and empower the opposition, and stuck in the middle was Newsom. He had built his national profile on projecting control, polished messaging, sharp presentations, strong optics. But this moment wasn't about optics. It was about navigating a party grappling with an internal identity crisis. And whether he liked it or not, he had become one of the central figures being scrutinized by both sides. Some in his party began questioning whether Newsom's approach aligned with the direction the party's base wanted to move. Others argued he represented the last thread of cohesion in a shifting landscape. Meanwhile, segments of the media began speculating whether the emerging factional divide signaled the beginning of a broader realignment, something that could reshape primaries, leadership structures, and even future presidential positioning. This is where the two storms collided, because the Comey situation didn't just create headlines, it created pressure, and pressure exposes fractures. Suddenly, Democratic leaders found themselves balancing two unfolding crises, one involving the public perception of institutional integrity and the other involving the internal struggle for ideological dominance. Republicans, of course, recognized the moment immediately, and they used it to their advantage. They tied their critiques of Comey to critiques of Democratic leadership. They framed the party's internal divide as a sign of weakness. They argued that a system this fractured couldn't possibly govern effectively, and as that messaging gained traction, the pressure on Newsom increased. Every statement he made, or didn't make, became part of the broader narrative. Every appearance, every interview, every comment was interpreted through the lens of a party in flux. The media environment shifted. Commentators spent hours debating not just the implications of the Comey evidence, but the emerging fault lines in the Democratic Party. Headlines blended the two stories into a single, sprawling conflict, and the political world realized something important. This wasn't a temporary flare-up. This was the first phase of a much larger battle for control over narrative, influence, and direction. Comey is back under fire. Newsom is scrambling for control, and the party is facing an identity crisis years in the making. The political aftershocks didn't settle after the Comey revelations. They grew stronger. What looked like a two-front crisis has now turned into a full-scale reshaping of political alliances, influence networks, and strategic priorities. Part 2 is where the pressure intensifies, because both Comey and Newsom are now at the center of storms that are feeding off each other. The first major development came from inside the Democratic Party itself. As the Comey story spread, internal factions didn't just disagree, they began openly maneuvering progressive leaders, already frustrated with the party's cautious approach to institutional accountability, saw the new evidence as confirmation that old political norms needed to be challenged more aggressively. They framed the moment as a test of moral consistency. If Democrats were going to criticize selective enforcement or questionable institutional behavior, they argued, then they needed to apply those principles universally, even when it involved powerful figures once considered allies. This argument gained traction quickly among younger activists, organizers, and influential voices on social media. They didn't approach the Comey news cautiously. They pushed for immediate clarity, immediate transparency, and immediate pressure. They saw hesitation from establishment Democrats as political survival instinct, not leadership. And in the middle of that tension stood Gavin Newsom. Newsom's brand has always been built on polished control. He knows how to project confidence, how to manage narratives, how to look steady even when the ground is shifting. But this time, his caution sparked confusion. Some Democrats wanted him to speak out decisively, to seize the moment and demonstrate that the party's leadership could still take bold moral stances. Others wanted him quiet and disciplined, avoiding any comment that could deepen the divide or inflame the situation. Instead of resolving the tension, Newsom's team found themselves stuck between competing narratives, each side demanding something different, and each side prepared to criticize him if he chose wrong. The scramble inside his office wasn't about a scandal of his own making. It was about an environment where the wrong tone, the wrong sentence, or even the wrong silence could become political ammunition. While Newsom's office weighed every possible move, House Republicans made theirs. They understood that the Comey revelations were a moment of opportunity, and they acted with the speed of a campaign that sees advantage. Republicans framed the new evidence as validation of long-standing concerns they believe were dismissed too quickly. They framed the Democratic divide as proof of instability, and most importantly, they tied the two storylines together, creating a narrative that suggested the party lacked direction, lacked unity, and lacked the capacity to manage a moment of national scrutiny. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Republican leadership anticipated that the Democratic Party wouldn't respond in unison, and they exploited the gap. They didn't just criticize Comey, they criticized the Democratic reactions to Comey. They didn't just pressure Newsom, they framed his hesitation as leadership failure. They portrayed the entire Democratic ecosystem as fragmented, reactive, and panicked. And for a portion of the public, that framing stuck. But the most interesting development came from inside the Democratic establishment. Some party leaders, watching the progressive faction grow louder and more influential, began to worry that the Comey moment would accelerate a power shift that had been slowly building for years. For them, this wasn't about Comey himself. It was about losing control of the narrative. They began pushing back, carefully, indirectly, using coded language about responsibility, institutional respect, and avoiding premature conclusions. They weren't shielding Comey. They were shielding the structure of the party. At the same time, progressive lawmakers used the moment to challenge traditional power brokers directly. Their argument was simple. If the party expects voters to trust institutions, then it must demonstrate that trust is earned, not assumed, and that required addressing controversial figures and decisions head-on. This internal struggle grew quickly, not because of Comey's personal legacy, but because the new evidence threatened to force the party to pick a side in a battle it had been postponing for years. Meanwhile, Newsom's struggle wasn't limited to internal fractures. Outside the party, political operatives and commentators began suggesting that his hesitation signaled deeper vulnerability. They questioned whether he could lead in a moment defined by conflict rather than presentation. They questioned whether he could satisfy a base demanding boldness while maintaining the support of a cautious establishment. Some even speculated that this moment could reshape future leadership contests, shifting momentum away from figures like Newsom and toward emerging voices with sharper, more definitive positions. But the true turning point came when national audiences began speaking. Not in polls, those will come later, but in the immediate reactions that shape momentum before the data arrives. Some voters saw Comey's renewed scrutiny as overdue. Others saw it as political opportunism resurfacing. Some saw Newsom's silence as disappointing. Others saw it as wise restraint. But what they all felt, regardless of ideology, was confusion, and confusion erodes trust faster than outrage. This is where the Comey crisis and the Newsom crisis merged into one political moment. Not because they're directly connected, but because they collided at the exact point where public confidence meets institutional responsibility. Republicans capitalized on that collision. Progressives seized it to push for ideological shifts. Establishment Democrats scrambled to hold the party structure together, and Newsom struggled to find footing in a moment where every path carried risk. The true measure of a political moment isn't in the first wave of reactions, it's in what comes after. In Part 3, the storm that began with newly surfaced evidence involving James Comey and the Democratic Party's internal shakeup has now evolved into something bigger, sharper, and far more dangerous. This is the phase where narratives turn into power, and power turns into direction. And the direction America appears to be moving in right now is one few expected, but many suspected was coming. What began as a scandal has morphed into a strategic confrontation that is reshaping both parties from the inside out. The most dramatic shift is happening behind the scenes in the Democratic Party. The power struggle that had been simmering quietly for years has finally broken the surface, and the Comey revelations acted as the catalyst. Progressive leaders, emboldened by the momentum created in the first wave of reactions, no longer view themselves as a faction operating alongside the party. They're behaving like a faction, preparing to challenge for control of the party itself. They believe the Comey controversy symbolizes a pattern: institutions operating without transparency, leadership unwilling to take risks, and a political structure slow to respond to the demands of an evolving base. These leaders sense that the window for influence is wide open, and they are stepping through it. This is where the fractures become unmistakable. Establishment Democrats are increasingly worried that the progressive surge isn't just emotional, it's strategic. They see a faction organized, energized, and prepared to capitalize on every moment the establishment hesitates, and the establishment has hesitated often over the past few years. Whether on economic policy, public safety, federal oversight, or national messaging, the divide between the two sides has grown too large to cover with talking points. Now, with the Comey situation reigniting debates about institutional trust, progressives feel they have a mandate to push harder than ever. In private, some Democratic strategists admit the shift is real. They can feel the momentum slipping, they can feel the pressure rising, and they know that once a party begins to lose control of its internal narrative, regaining it becomes increasingly difficult. Which brings us to Gavin Newsom. Newsom is caught in the riptide of this internal struggle, not because he caused it, but because he represents the very image both sides are fighting to define. To progressives, he embodies the polished, cautious, establishment-aligned leader who prioritizes stability over structural change. To moderates, he represents the last line of defense against a party drifting too far from center. To both sides, he is becoming a symbol of what direction the party will choose. And that is why his every move is now being dissected through a new lens, not just as a governor, but as a potential national figure navigating a power shift that could either elevate him or sideline him permanently. This is where Republicans enter the story with a clarity that has startled even their own critics. While Democrats are locked in a struggle over identity, Republicans see opportunity. They understand momentum when they see it. They understand vulnerability when it appears, and they understand how to turn internal division in the opposition into external advantage. Republican strategists have been working to tie the Comey revelations to broader concerns about institutional authority. They are connecting dots between the controversy, the Democratic response, and the party's internal disarray. Their message is simple. If Democrats can't control their own narrative, how can they control the country's? And this message is landing with remarkable precision. The broader electorate may not care deeply about every detail of the Comey documents, but they do care about stability. They care about coherence. They care about leadership that looks decisive rather than scrambled. For Republicans, the goal isn't to make voters trust them unconditionally. It's to make voters question whether Democrats can unify during a crisis. That's a powerful strategy, because doubt, once planted, grows quickly. But the most important shift isn't happening in Washington. It's happening at the national level among everyday Americans who are watching this unfold. People are beginning to interpret this moment not as a one-off controversy, but as a symptom of a deeper structural imbalance. For some, Comey symbolizes unresolved questions about federal institutions. For others, Newsom symbolizes a party struggling to adapt to new ideological realities. For many, the entire episode symbolizes a political system teetering between old norms and new pressures. This is where the political era begins to change. The more the public sees exposed divisions, the more they begin questioning whether either party has a long-term vision capable of addressing real concerns. The stability of institutions, the accountability of leaders, the future of justice, and the balance of power. Inside the Democratic Party, the chaos has accelerated discussions about long-term leadership. Some insiders now wonder whether Newsom remains the face of the future, or a figure representing the last generation of traditional party leadership. Others warn that underestimating his ability to navigate chaos would be a mistake, pointing to his resilience and ability to weather political storms. But the truth is clear. He no longer controls the narrative. He's trying to regain it, but for the first time, he is reacting to events rather than shaping them. As for Comey, whether the new evidence leads to further inquiry or fades into political background noise almost doesn't matter anymore. His name has become a proxy for the deeper question: what do Americans expect from their institutions? The renewed scrutiny has exposed not just Comey's legacy, but the fragile relationship between the public and federal power. Republicans want deeper investigations, progressives want broader accountability, moderates want stability, and the DOJ itself remains silent, watching the political consequences swirl without offering clarity. This is the storm underneath the headlines. Not Comey, not Newsom, but the question of who controls the future narrative of American politics. The political confrontation that began with newly surfaced evidence involving James Comey has now evolved far beyond a single controversy. It has triggered something larger, something deeper, a shift that is reshaping both parties and redefining the future of American political power. What began as a clash of narratives has turned into a contest for control over the very direction of national politics. The scrutiny on Comey didn't just reopen old debates. It reignited unresolved questions about how institutions wield their authority and how much trust the public places in them. To his critics, the new evidence represents validation, a long-awaited moment where serious concerns about federal oversight, decision-making, and political influence can be revisited openly. They see this as an opportunity to push for reforms that were never fully addressed. To his defenders, however, the renewed tension risks distorting complex history. They warn that political motivations could overshadow facts, turning Comey into a symbol rather than a subject of objective evaluation. They see a danger in letting public pressure determine the significance of institutional decisions. But while the country debates what Comey's situation means for federal credibility, the Democratic Party is facing a more immediate crisis, one happening not in the public arena but inside its own structure. The internal struggle has grown so intense that it no longer resembles a disagreement. It resembles a fight for control. Progressive leaders see this moment as a turning point, a chance to define the party's future rather than remain a faction within it. They feel empowered, energized, and validated by the base in ways the establishment can no longer ignore. Their argument is simple: the party must evolve, move boldly, and confront institutional inconsistencies head-on if it wants to regain trust. The establishment sees something far different. They view the same moment as a threat to coherence, strategy, and electoral stability. They worry that abandoning discipline for ideological fervor risks alienating the very voters who make national victory possible, and they see the Comey controversy as proof that the party cannot afford to fracture in public when the opposition is unified. Caught between these two forces is Gavin Newsom. His political brand, precision, composure, confidence, has served him well in moments where optics mattered most. But this moment is not about optics, it's about identity, power, and the soul of the party. And Newsom now finds himself navigating a landscape where neither side is willing to give ground. Progressives view him as a product of the old political model, controlled messaging, institutional loyalty, and caution. They question whether a figure like him can lead a party whose base is demanding something more raw, more direct, more transformative. The establishment views him as one of the few leaders capable of restoring coherence in a rapidly splintering environment. They lean on him for stability, hoping he can project strength at a moment when the party feels directionless. Both factions want leadership, neither faction agrees on what leadership should look like, and this is where Republicans have executed their strategy with precision. They aren't focusing on the finer points of the Comey revelations. They aren't concentrating on the details of Democratic statements. They are zeroing in on division, using it to paint the entire party as unstable, unfocused, and unprepared for national leadership. Their argument is straightforward. How can a party govern a nation if it can't govern itself? Republican strategists understand the power of perception. They know that if the public begins to see the Democratic Party as fractured and hesitant, then even voters who disagree with Republican positions might drift toward them simply because they appear more unified. Momentum in politics doesn't always flow toward the strongest. It often flows away from the most chaotic. Meanwhile, the public is absorbing all of this with growing frustration. People feel like every institution is under scrutiny. Every leader seems reactive instead of forward-thinking. Every controversy becomes a proxy battle for bigger ideological wars. And exhaustion is beginning to shape political perception as much as ideology itself. Voters aren't just asking what the Comey evidence means. They're asking what it means for the future of leadership in the country. This is where the landscape takes an even sharper turn. Several long-term trends are now visible. First, the Democratic Party is shifting permanently. The progressive base has gained too much influence to be contained, and the establishment can no longer dictate direction without resistance. The balance of power is changing. Second, Newsom's national viability has entered a new, unpredictable phase. He remains a prominent figure, but his ability to unite a divided party is now under the microscope. He must decide whether to evolve with the shifting base or defend the traditional Democratic structure, and both paths come with risks. Third, Republicans are capitalizing on the moment with discipline. Their ability to appear coherent while Democrats debate identity gives them a strategic advantage heading into future elections. Fourth, the renewed focus on Comey has reopened deeper questions about institutional trust. This isn't a temporary flare-up. It's a recalibration of how Americans view federal power, justice, and accountability. Fifth, the political environment is entering a new era, one where internal ideological battles carry as much weight as external partisan conflict. The struggle within each party might end up shaping the next decade more than any single election. Comey's situation may have ignited the conversation. Newsom's scramble may have exposed the internal fractures, but the real story is much larger. The country is witnessing a shift in political gravity. Institutions are being questioned. Parties are being reshaped. Leadership is being tested. Voters are demanding clarity in an era defined by confusion. This is not a crisis. This is a transformation. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.